Flying an aircraft with the majority of its most important systems failed is a nightmare that we pilots are not even trained to handle, since that just shouldn't even be possible. But what if it happened anyway? And what if that same failure would also turn the aircraft completely invisible, just as it's flying towards another aircraft? Despite the high level of redundancy built into every airliner, almost all the features of modern airplanes still rely on one thing: electricity. That's why an aircraft's electrical system has some of the most complex safety features known to man. But what happens if those redundancies would still fail? Well, we're about to find out, since that's exactly what happened to an EasyJet Airbus A319 back on the 15th of September 2006, on a regularly scheduled flight from Alicante in Spain up to Bristol in England. The crew started their day on the 15th of September by flying an aircraft down to Alicante early in the morning, where they then expected to do an aircraft change and fly a new aircraft up to Bristol. But while they were en route down towards Alicante, they had then received a message from their company via the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS, and it informed them that the aircraft that they were supposed to fly up to Bristol had suffered a fault with its number one electrical generator, and that they should therefore plan to fly it back from Alicante with that generator turned off. Letting them know this early was a great thing to do, because it allowed the pilots to plan ahead for how to operate the airplane with this slightly degraded state. For the first hour of the flight up towards Bristol, everything seemed normal. Flight 6074 climbed to its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet and then proceeded north across Spain and up through France. The electrical power system was working as designed, and other than the inoperative number one generator and the running APU, there was nothing abnormal at all. That is, until time 10:52, when Flight 6074 was passing overhead Nantes in northwestern France, when something suddenly went horribly wrong. Remember how that faulty sensor could sense current in the generator line even when there was nothing there, erroneously triggering the GCU's welded protection? Yeah, that's exactly what now happened. With the generator turned off, the GLC should be open, but if current is detected in the generator line despite this, that could indicate a failure of the GLC open function. So in order to prevent the current from backflowing through an improperly closed GLC and entering into the generator, the GCU now instead opened the number one bus tie connector to prevent electricity from entering the entire left part of the electrical network. But of course that also caused electricity to stop flowing from the APU through the transfer bus bar into AC bus 1, and therefore also into the AC Essential bus bar. Now, while the electrical system can automatically reconfigure to supply AC bus 1 from a different generator if the number one generator should fail, it can't automatically reconfigure to power the AC Essential bus bar from AC bus 2 in the event of a failure of AC bus 1. On more recent Airbus models, this reconfiguration has also been made automatic, but on the older and less advanced Airbus A320 series, it wasn't. Instead, the pilots had to manually switch the AC Essential bus bar to receive power from AC bus 2 by pressing something known as the AC Essential feed button on the electrical system overhead control panel. And when the AC Essential bus bar is not powered, a caption light reading fault should be illuminated under that button. And after the system is then manually reconfigured, that fault light should go out and be replaced by an alternate light instead. As soon as the AC Essential bus bar depowers, this failure is immediately also displayed on the ECAM screen, along with the required action to press the AC Essential bus bar button. And the idea was that this should result in the AC Essential bus bar being depowered for only a very short time before the pilots could reconfigure the system. But that was just the manufacturer's assumption, and as we will soon see, in reality things are sometimes a lot more complicated. At the same moment that the welded protection activated the number one GCU, the pilots heard a clunk sound, followed by an avalanche of failures. The captain's instruments all went blank, the autopilot and auto thrust disconnected, the master warning sounded, and most of the lights on the overhead panel went completely dark. In fact, the list of systems that became inoperative at that precise moment was so long that it would have been almost impossible for the pilots to grasp the true extent of this failure. The loss of AC bus 1 and the AC Essential bus bar resulted in not only the things that I've already mentioned, but also the loss of the blue hydraulic system, loss of the number 3 spoiler on each wing, loss of 2 out of 3 air data inertial reference units, reversion of the fly-by-wire control system to alternate law, loss of normal landing gear extension, loss of automatic cabin pressure control, loss of both automatic and manual passenger oxygen mask deployment, loss of all 3 radio management units and audio control panels, loss of the primary transponder, loss of the traffic collision avoidance system, loss of the ground proximity warning system, and loss of VHF Radio 1. And those were just the most obvious things. The full list of lost items actually goes on for about 3 full A4 pages. Anyway, the first thing that the captain did when all of this happened was to hand over the controls to the first officer, since at least he had working instruments on his side. The pilots then tried to quickly diagnose the failure, but that proved extremely difficult, since not only were so many systems gone, but a lot of the indicator lights showing each system's status had also failed. The pilot's best initial guess was that the APU had somehow tripped off, depowering the left side electrical network, but that turned out to be wrong. Fortunately though, the first officer found that the plane was controllable in manual flight, despite the loss of all normal low flight envelope protections and automation. But of course, flying the aircraft manually in alternate low at that altitude would have likely taken up most of his attention. Meanwhile, the captain focused on examining the ECAM, which displayed a large number of warnings and caution messages. The upper screen of the dual display ECAM had failed, but the lower screen was thankfully still running off the AC Bus 2. Among the ECAM messages was a warning that read, "ELEC AC Essential Bus fault," with the prompt to press the AC Essential feed button to restore power over to the AC Essential bus. But when the pilots looked up at the button, they observed that the fault caption under it wasn't illuminated as it should. The captain tried pressing the button anyway to switch the AC Essential bus over to AC Bus 2, but the button didn't appear to do anything and the system did not reconfigure. Now we don't know why this button didn't work. With this failure condition, the fault caption should have been illuminated and the button should have worked normally, but the change of the caption status from fault over to alternate on the button was the only positive assurance that the crew had to see if they've actually pressed the button correctly. There was no change in the button position itself. So if there was something wrong with the caption light, well then the pilots wouldn't have had any way of knowing whether they had pressed the button far enough or if they had pressed it the correct number of times. So it is possible that the reconfiguration failed because the button was actually pressed twice in very quick succession without the captain realizing it. But we were never able to possibly confirm that. It is also quite possible that there were some kind of further malfunction that the investigators just were never able to find. Anyway, the captain tried several times to reconfigure the electrical system, but they were all unsuccessful. So pretty soon it became clear that they likely wouldn't be able to restore any of these failed systems. But at least they had the aircraft under control and they were still able to track the navigational aids that they had in front of them, which they would need in order to be able to reach their destination. So by the principle of aviate, navigate, communicate, this meant that the first 2 priorities were at least covered, so the captain decided to now focus his efforts on the third emergency priority, communication. And as it turns out, it was actually the lack of this that would turn this flight into something really scary. You see, one of the systems that failed at the onset of the emergency was the VHF Radio 1, since it was powered by the DC Essential bus bar, which in turn was powered by AC Bus 1. And the VHF Radio 1 is normally used for communication with air traffic control. VHF Radio 2 and 3 were still technically working since they were powered by the right side electrical network, but because all 3 audio control panels drew power from the left network, the pilots now had no way to actually selecting either of those working radios. So this left the crew with no way to contact air traffic control at all. And to make matters even worse, the primary transponder had also failed. And while there was a backup transponder powered by the right side electrical network, the pilots would have need to think of switching over to that transponder manually. And they certainly now had other things to think about. So with that in mind, you might be wondering how the air traffic controllers reacted to all of this. And As it turns out, that's one of the craziest parts of this entire story. At the moment the electrical failure happened, Flight 6074 was passing through airspace controlled from the Brest Area Control Center in northwest France. And at that facility, a shift change was just about to begin, when the controller monitoring Flight 6074 suddenly noticed that the Airbus A319 had disappeared from his radar screen. You see, air traffic controllers normally rely on secondary radar, which interrogates an airplane's transponder in order to determine its identity, position, speed, altitude and so on, and then display it on the controller's screen. I think when most people hear the word radar, they think of primary radar, which bounces radio waves off airborne objects to determine their position. But as it turns out, the controllers in Brest didn't have any primary radar available, meaning that they just couldn't see any aircraft flying without a transponder. So as soon as the controller noticed that Flight 6074 had disappeared from his screen, he tried calling the pilots several times but received no response back. The captain was still trying to contact air traffic control by switching to VHF radio 2, which was unsuccessful, and he also attempted to declare Mayday on the universal emergency frequency of 121.5 MHz, but that didn't work either. He then tried to restore electrical power by turning the number 1 generator on and then off, which also didn't work, and after about 10 minutes of totally unsuccessful efforts, he then moved on to lower priority ECAM actions, one of which told him to switch to number 2 transponder, which he did. The transponder control panel was unlit and didn't appear to be responsive, but when he switched to the standby transponder, the digits showing the currently selected code came back. With the rest of the panel still unlit, the pilots weren't sure whether the transponder was actually working, but just in case, the crew changed the transponder code over to 7700, the universal emergency code. The other choice they would have been to change it over to 7600, which is the code for radio failure. But with so many systems inoperative, I think that the emergency code was likely the better choice here. Back in the Brest Control Center, the aircraft now reappeared on the radar screens, squawking 7700, finally confirming to the controllers that the aircraft was indeed in trouble, but at least it was still flying and they could see it. Brest ATC had now informed West Drayton ATC, its counterpart across the channel, about the situation, and in turn West Drayton had informed Bristol, so the controllers there knew that the plane was coming in. Since the backup transponder was working, the controllers were able to keep other planes out of Flight 604's way and eventually allow it to slot itself onto the approach sequence. At the same time, Bristol ATC had also declared an emergency on behalf of the flight and positioned fire crews to meet the aircraft on the landing, since, remember, they had no idea what kind of emergency the flight was actually facing. They only knew that it was squawking 7700. As the aircraft lined up for its approach, the controller also tried broadcasting the wind and landing clearance in blind, hoping that Flight 6074 might hear it, which they sadly didn't. But that was a good effort. And on board the plane, the pilots now started preparing for landing by extending the flaps, which worked despite the pilot's doubt about the hydraulic system. But when they selected the landing gear lever down, the gear didn't deploy and none of the gear lights illuminated. Turns out that the landing gear is prevented from deploying above a certain airspeed by a device called the landing gear safety valve. But because that valve had lost all of its airspeed data sources due to the electrical failure, it had now defaulted to closed. Fortunately, the pilots reacted quickly and were able to successfully extend the landing gear using the alternate gear extension mechanism. And the captain also tried to call air traffic control using his cell phone during the approach, but unfortunately without being able to reach them. Now, I just love that kind of thinking outside of the box. That's yet another great example of resilience in my view. In the end, despite the lack of contact with air traffic control and the numerous system failures, the first officer was able to land the aircraft perfectly and then bring it to a safe stop on the runway. And also, despite slightly degraded nosewheel steering, the captain was then able to taxi the aircraft off the runway to its parking stand. And after that, all 144 passengers and crew safely disembarked the aircraft. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.